Hi, this is Dr. Thomas Armstrong. I'm doing a series of videos to promote my new book, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Neurodivergent Brain. This is a completely revised and updated second edition of a book that I originally wrote in 2010. The topic of this video is Social Values Dictate Who is Disordered. I've long believed that whether you will be diagnosed as disordered, normal, or gifted depends more upon when and where you're born than anything intrinsic to yourself as an individual. And that's why we need to be very careful with the diagnostic terms that we're throwing around these days. First, let's look at the when. Back before the Civil War, a physician named Samuel T. Cartwright wrote an article for DuBose Review, a Louisiana journal, and he wrote that he had discovered a new medical disorder called drapetomania. Drapeto means to flee, and mania means an obsession. So basically, drapetomania means an obsession with fleeing. Dr. Cartwright believed that drapetomania afflicted large numbers of runaway slaves, and that with appropriate identification and treatment, they could live a productive and successful life back on the plantation. Now, this is obvious racism to us now, but to his time and his day, this was considered good science. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and we have the North Dakota Institution for the Feeble-Minded, which was constructed in 1903. This was back in the day when people who didn't score well on IQ tests were considered feeble-minded. This is from the New York Times, 1913. Nearly 15 million school children are defectives. Pretty amazing title coming from the New York Times. If you look at the pie chart on the left-hand side, you'll see how that group has been cut into different groups. There are the morons, the imbeciles, the physically defective, and the idiots. Now, idiot and moron and imbecile were diagnostic terms used by physicians and psychiatrists and psychologists back in the day. Now they're insults, but back then they were, again, considered to be science. In 1927, the Supreme Court handed down a case affirming the constitutionality of involuntary sterilization of individuals who were morons, who were considered morons, imbeciles, or idiots. The Chief Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, wrote in the decision, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Notice how close that sounds to something that Adolf Hitler said 5 years later. He wrote, "It is right that the worthless lives of such creatures should be ended, and that this would result in certain savings in terms of hospitals, doctors, and nursing staff." In fact, Hitler was enamored of the United States program for eugenics and adopted some of its principles in his own answer to the final solution. Fast forward to the 1970s, and here we have the convention of the American Psychiatric Association. And this fellow who is represented here in the mask is actually a gay psychiatrist. And the reason he is in a mask and a wig and a strange coat and bow tie is that he cannot let people know who he is. or he will be drummed out of the bugle corps, because at that time, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder, and you could not be a psychiatrist and have the mental disorder of being gay. But his appearance at this conference shocked many people, and it actually had a positive result. The next year, the psychiatrists in a shift declared that homosexuality was no longer a mental illness. It's hard for us to appreciate this today, where being gay, where LGBTQ movements and ethos is so much a part of our culture and so accepted legally and in other ways. And it's the minority who are the ones who believe that it is suspect or deviant. And yet, all psychiatrists before 1973 believed it was a mental illness. So amazing what time can bring. Now let's look at the where. No matter where you are, different places have different expectations and different values, and that may determine whether you're considered normal, gifted, or disordered. If you grew up among the Puluwa culture in the Central Caroline Islands in Micronesia, you'd be expected to uh, understand navigation intimately. They live on several hundred different islands. And so the ability to recognize the bumps on the horizon, the ability to read the currents in the water, notice if you're wandering toward a coral reef and so forth, those are considered marks of high intelligence. And the people who do best at navigation, they are the chief navigators of society and have even more prestige than the political leaders. And I bring this up because there are a lot of us who do well in the world of school and books and communication. But if we were growing up in a culture like that and we happened to be people who had trouble finding their cars in large shopping malls, we might end up in a program for remediation, navigation remediation. On the other hand, kids that in our schools have high spatial intelligence, but they do poorly in reading and math and might be put in special education programs, transplanted into a culture like that would be the gifted ones. Among the Anong in northern Nigeria, as a child, you'd be expected to know hundreds of songs and dances because music has a pivotal place in the culture. And if you had, say, amusia or dysmusia, you might be taken aside and worked with intensively so that you could respond musically to the cultural rhythms of your surroundings. Now, of course, we don't talk a lot about dysmusia, do we? We talk more about dyslexia, and that's because our value system is geared towards words rather than music. And yet dysmusia is a problem for people in a musical culture. I'd also like to go on record as saying we create categories of deviance largely to uphold sacrosanct social values. And this was actually not my original idea. This was an idea that was shared by the president of the American Psychological Association back in the 1960s. What I'd like to do is go through the 7 diversities that I focus the most attention on in my book, The Power of Neurodiversity, and see what particular values they seem to violate. Autism. What social value do you think that it violates? Well, we have the individual who is not reaching out and communicating, at least not to people who are non-autistics. And so the social value they violate is sociability. We expect people in our culture to be sociable, to work well in groups, to have empathy, to engage in give and take, to have clear communications, and so on. And people with autism, if they have difficulty in that area, they're violating that social convention, which is why we have, I think, in part, this disorder in the first place. Why isn't it okay for someone not to want to communicate with other people, but to have other languages, so to speak? ADHD, a disorder they violate. Here we have this cheeky guy, presumably with ADHD. One of the social values people with ADHD violate is delay of gratification. They also violate values like focus, patience, and so on. But delay of gratification is a big one. You might remember a famous experiment that came out of Stanford University, where they sat a child down in front of a lone marshmallow, and then they left the room, or before they left, they said, "Now I'm leaving for just a bit, and when I come back, if you haven't eaten that marshmallow, I'll give you two more." And so they just discovered who were the kids who would gobble up the mushroom, couldn't stand waiting all that long, and those who waited patiently and got three marshmallows instead of just one. This experiment the results were tied to outcomes in later life. Those individuals who were able to delay gratification seemed to do better in school and seem to have better outcomes in other aspects of adult life. And so ADHD would obviously be part of that problem with delayed gratification. Nicholas Hobbs, the president of the American Psychological Association back in the 1960s, suggested that kids who were hyperactive violated the Protestant work ethic, which is part of what has informed United States culture and informed the rise of capitalism. And there's a book out that Max Weber wrote called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Capitalist Spirit. And he suggested that, all those values of the work ethic of ambition and patience and delayed gratification were part of what made our country great. And you can see that kids with ADHD violated all of those. And therefore, we have to consider that a handicapping condition. What about dyslexia? What social value do they violate? Well, basically, they violate the social value of literacy. We expect all people in our culture to be literate or to be striving towards literacy. If you go to a cocktail party and you say to somebody, I can't balance my checkbook, everybody will kind of laugh and chuckle and say, oh, yeah, I have a problem with that too. But if you say, gosh, I can't read, there's going to be more than likely shocked silence because this is an expectation we have for everybody. And the ones who violate that are the ones with dyslexia, who have trouble decoding the printed word. The interesting thing to note, however, is that literacy is relatively recent in history. It's only, literacy, all told, is about 5,000 years old. And in terms of universal literacy, where we expect everyone to be literate, probably 100 or 200 years old at the most in terms of our public schools. Yet for thousands and thousands of years previous to that, we have honored oral language transmission. And the sagas, the epics, things like the Iliad, the Odyssey, and other epics around the world have been communicated oftentimes through chanting, through storytelling, even through songs and dances. And interestingly enough, it's often pointed out that kids with dyslexia have high oral language abilities. And yet, this kind of fades into the background. What they don't do is what receives the most attention. And I suggest that it's unfair for us to stigmatize kids with dyslexia simply because they have difficulty doing something that was only really created relatively recently in our history as a human species. What social value does intellectual disabilities violate? And the answer is in the disorder itself. Here we have a child with Down syndrome, one of the probably the most prevalent form of intellectual disability. And the social value that is violated is intelligence itself. And how do we measure intelligence? Through an intelligence test, unfortunately. And the people who score the intelligence tests construct something that's called the bell curve, because it looks a little bit like a bell, where most people score right in the middle at the mean. A few people score at the high end, and a few people score at the low end. And that's where we got our morons, our imbeciles, and our idiots. These were actually categories related to IQ scores. And yet, there are other models of intelligence than this one that are not part of our social value, but should be. I include Dr. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, which gives a much more fine-grained view of human differences. Mood disorders, things like unipolar depression, which is what I have, bipolar disorder, and so forth. The social value they seem to violate is happiness. We value happiness in our culture. We expect people to be happy. We think everybody should be happy. We've got, it's everywhere in our culture. We've got the happy meal, the happy face, the happy self-help book. There's even a book called 10% Happier, and workshops on how to be happy and so forth. And yet, is that the ultimate goal of life, to be happy? Or are there other even darker realms of human experience that deserve to be experienced and explored? And that's a big question. Anxiety disorders. What would be the problem? What would be the social value there? Well, here we have a variety of anxiety disorders such as OCD, PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, and various phobias, among others. They seem to violate the social value of tranquility, which is again something that we value a great deal, even if we don't practice it a lot. Having tranquilizing music, having tranquilizers, which started use in the 1950s with the first tranquilizer, which was Miltown. I remember my father took Miltown in the 1950s. And so the tranquilizer and the tranquilizing music all suggest that it's better to be tranquil than to be anxious. Even though anxiety in many ways is connected to creativity, even though young adults who are more anxious are less likely to have traffic accidents, among other things. And then finally, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia could be paranoid schizophrenia or other forms along the spectrum of schizophreniform disorder and so forth, where an individual doesn't exactly have a split personality, but where the distinctions between what comes from the inner voice and what comes from the outer world get mixed up considerably for many people. This seems to violate the social value of rationality, the ability to think things through. I have a friend who has schizophrenia, and he believes there are people up in his attic who are threatening him. And, you know, I've wanted to say to him, well, have you thought of going up there and checking and seeing if there are these people? But, you know, there's no purpose to it because his brain is telling him there are, in fact, those people. It's irrational, and yet it's built in to this particular disorder. Fortunately, antipsychotic medication is helping him and helping others adapt more closely to the way things are in reality. Of course, reality, again, from a philosophical point of view, can mean different things to different people. William Blake, the great painter and poet, was more of a romantic and felt that rationality was a threat to the more humanistic values. And so he drew this picture of Isaac Newton busily doing something very rational with his compass and his geometric figures. But we value science, most of us do, and we value clear thinking, mathematical thinking, cause and effect thinking, if this, then that kind of thinking. And those who don't do this concern us, and it seems like they have violated our rational social values. This is an image of one of the first, this is either a prison or a mental hospital, and it's called the Panopticon. It was developed by Jeremy Bentham, who was a utilitarian philosopher of the late 18th century. And in this model, the psychiatrists or the prison warden would stand in the middle of, in that little lighthouse thing and be able to have eye contact virtually with every cell in every part of that building. And it sort of heralded the beginning of looking at madness as a psychiatric problem that could be remediated through rational means. And look how rational this is with all the rooms geometrically arranged in this circular form. So that's a little bit about social values, telling us what kinds of disorders we need to have in order to protect those social values. I hope you've gotten something out of this lecture or video. I hope you share my book, The Power of Neurodiversity, with friends, family, teachers, therapists, and others who would benefit from seeing the power of individuals coming together, all who have different gifts, who can make a new society, particularly when we develop a society of tolerance. If you want to receive my blog posts, sign up on my homepage. My website address is institute4learning.com. That's institute4learning.com. Sign up and you will receive a 200-item neurodiversity strengths checklist that is already part of my updated book, The Power of Neurodiversity. So thanks again, and I wish you all the best wherever you are. Be well.